Hello Year 11 and welcome to your geography lesson for this week. I just wanted to start by showing you the specification for your unit on human landscapes of the UK. Hopefully you have an understanding of your case study now, which is London, and you've been working on that over the Christmas holidays. During the Christmas holidays you would have looked through 5.3 to 5.5 and within your booklet, you will have covered all of these specification points. So making sure you have a really good understanding of the significance of London's site and its connectivity, making sure you understand London's structure with regards to its central business district, inner city, suburbs and rural urban fringe, and also the functions of the city and how they might vary across the city. You also need to have a good understanding of the causes of national and international migration and also the reasons for different levels of inequality across London. Hopefully you remember that we looked at Newham and Richmond within that Christmas booklet and looking at the differences between the services, employment, education and health between those two different parts of the city. So Newham and Richmond would be your case studies for that. Hopefully as well you have a good understanding of what deindustrialisation looks like, how that has impacted London. So we're on to 5.5a here for deindustrialisation, and obviously the movement of businesses and people outside of London. Last lesson, you would have learnt about regeneration and rebranding of the city, and we specifically looked at Stratford, and you should have produced and submitted an 8-mark question, an 8-mark PEQ on regeneration and rebranding of Stratford. If you haven't yet submitted that, it's really important you get your work handed in on time to your teacher so we can keep a record of the marks you're achieving in your practice exam questions. Lesson, you're going to be looking at making London sustainable, making urban living sustainable. So I want you to be able to define sustainability. That's a really important key term for today's lesson. I also want you to be able to describe and explain the sustainable urban strategies that are taking place in London and start thinking about their positive impact on urban living. We're going to look heavily at quality of life as well today. So how can sustainability and sustainable strategies improve people's quality of life? As with everything, you should also at the end evaluate the success of these different sustainable urban strategies, and hopefully this will all become clear as we go through the lesson. So please now take some time to pause the video and copy down these 2 key words. So as I mentioned, sustainability and quality of life are 2 really important terms for today's lesson. So sustainability is the ability to provide for current generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now that sounds really complex and confusing, but all it means is ensuring that today we live our lives in a way that we aren't, losing out in any way. We're still meeting our own needs, but we're not having a negative impact on future generations. So an example would be if, in the future we all start driving electric cars. An electric car is going to still get us from A to B. It's not that we're saying we have to revert to walking everywhere or revert to really old-fashioned horse and carts to not pollute the earth. We could still get from A to B if we used an electric car, but that is going to reduce the impact of climate change on future generations. So that would be a really good example. An electric car would be a really good example of a sustainable approach of how we can live our lives. And I imagine that's going to become more and more common as electric cars become more and more affordable in the future. Quality of life is a measure of how wealthy people are. However, it's not actually measuring income. So it's not measuring wealth, but it's measuring wealth in terms of things like housing and employment and environmental factors. So our quality of life can be very, very good, and we might not be very, very rich. And just like you could be very, very rich and actually still have quite a poor quality of life. So it's not just based on income. So we need to think about, okay, well, what is the quality of life like for people in London, and how can quality of life be improved? So this is just a slide, and you will have the PowerPoint slide that you can obviously look at in your own time. This is just a little refresher on what sustainability is. And quite often we need to consider sustainability as this three-legged stool. And on those each of those three legs are the economy, society, and the environment. And you need all three in order for this to actually be a supporting structure, and it supports sustainability. You can't really be truly sustainable if you are not considering society, so if you're not considering people within your community. You also can't be truly sustainable if you're not considering the environment, just in the same way that you can't be truly sustainable if you're not taking in any consideration of the economy and the jobs that people do. So you need to make sure, to be extremely sustainable, you really need to be able to look at all three of these different strategies and all three of these different elements of life. So that's really, really important. So looking at sustainability, you have to consider the environment, you have to consider people in society, and you have to consider the economy. So that's just a little refresher. So, as I mentioned, quality of life is a measurement of how wealthy people are, but it does not necessarily include income. So you can just pause this now and think about, okay, well, how could we measure people's quality of life? So try and think about it for yourself for a couple of minutes, write down as many different things as you can, and then we can go through some together. Okay, so hopefully you got some of the things that are going to come up now. This one, access to healthcare or education, is really important. So if people have good access to healthcare and education, then that will improve their quality of life. The quality of the government service that is provided, again, will improve quality of life. Access to affordable housing. The levels of transport congestion, and obviously air quality, but also just the stress of lots and lots of traffic on your commute can really impact your quality of life. So transport's a big one. Obviously, transport congestion can also lead to lots of pollution within local areas, and that can really impact air quality and make people quite unwell. Access to adequate sanitation, again, do people have running water? Is that something that is available? It might be that you are a very rich person in an area that does not have this. So quality of life really needs to be considered in terms of this as well. And we've already talked about air pollution, but water pollution is very important and can definitely impact your quality of life too. It's no good, as I'll just go back to water pollution, it's no good having lots and lots of money if you can't actually buy good quality water. So you might have lots of money, but you might still not actually be able to access water that is safe for you and enough of it. So that is how quality of life doesn't always directly link to wealth. And then crime levels. So crime levels, obviously, again, you might be very wealthy in terms of the money that you have, but you might live in an area that is targeted by crime because they know that the people there are wealthy. So all of these things you hopefully have now seen are all impacting somebody's quality of life, but they're not all directly related to how much money people are earning. Okay, so your main task actually for today is going to be to look at the different strategies really that London are taking in order to become more sustainable. So there are two tasks. This is task one, and we'll just go through it quickly together. So it says London needs to become more sustainable to improve the quality of life for people living and working in the city. There are many problems in London that could be solved by being more sustainable. So I want you to study these images, and I want you to think about whether or not they're a solution to a problem. And if they are a solution to a problem, what is the problem they are trying to solve? Once you've figured that out, I want you to also think about how this solution might improve Londoners' quality of life. So I'd suggest you probably want to pick at least 3 of the images here and try to do those 3 things for them. So if we do one together, so the first picture there is showing one of London's red buses. And hopefully you know that these red buses are hybrid buses, so they do not pollute, they do not release as much carbon either into the atmosphere. Now, what problem is that lovely red bus trying to solve? So these buses obviously are trying to encourage people to use public transport and take the number of cars off the road. That in itself would improve Londoners' quality of life by reducing the air pollution within the city. So hopefully that has given you an idea of what I want you to do on this task. So go through, some of them are more obvious than others. Go through and maybe pick 3 of them to try and think about, okay, what is this? What problem is it solving? And how might that solution improve Londoners' quality of life? And then your second and final task of the day is basically to go through the next couple of slides, which have got some information on from the textbook, and complete the table on slide 9. Now, these pictures, hopefully you realise, were showing the following things. So in the blue box, transport, okay, so how can all the people in London be transported sustainably? So obviously the Santander bikes and also the red buses now, they are ways that are trying to help people get around London in a more sustainable way that is polluting the atmosphere less, so polluting the local environment, but also reducing carbon emissions. Affordable housing, so at the moment, cheaper housing is often found outside of London, meaning people have to travel a long way to get into work. There is actually very little affordable housing in inner London. If you want to live in inner London or in the CBD near to the offices, it's very, very expensive. So that's a problem that obviously needs to be solved. Energy efficiency costs a lot of money to run a house. And one way London could try to be more sustainable is by improving the energy efficiency. Things like energy saving light bulbs use less energy and therefore your electric bills will come down. This picture here is of a community called BedZ or Beddington Zero, and this is found in Sutton in London, and this is a basically zero carbon community. So the people living there do not emit any carbon into the atmosphere, but also their electricity bills, their water bills, and all of that are much lower. So that is helping not only people's quality of life, but it's also helping London be more sustainable. Here are 3 YouTube clips that you can click on if you have the PowerPoint. And these 3 YouTube clips you can watch to learn more about BedZ and how it is sustainable. So employment as well. So this has changed quite dramatically in the pandemic, but obviously people now are working from home a lot more. And in order to be more sustainable and improve people's quality of lives, offices before the pandemic were looking at letting people work from home more anyway. Obviously, if you can work from home a couple of days a week, your quality of life is probably going to improve. You're going to avoid commuting, travelling to work, and those busy trains and busy roads, and that will hopefully as well reduce the carbon emissions within London too. Then green space. So green space is quite abundant. There's a lot of it in London. We're quite lucky that we have lots of lovely parks in London. Some people suggest that we should use more of that green space to create more affordable housing. So I want you to think about whether you think that would be a good idea. And then finally, waste. Obviously, there are lots of us living in London. Waste disposal cost over £600 million in 2015 in London. So London recycles less than the rest of the UK, with 27 of the 33 boroughs recycling below the national average. So that is obviously something that needs to be solved. So this is the information you need for your second and final task. So go through and read on your own about the problem of transport and the challenges that we face tackling it. Have these problems been tackled? How can they be tackled in the future? You're going to complete this, so you can access this on your PowerPoint and type it in, or you could copy this onto paper and you could just write out this yourself. So it's completely up to you. I've done the first one for you and started the second one too, but it says, what is the issue? So you could try and write a description in that first box about transport. What is the issue? Then give an example of how this issue affects London's sustainability and or people's quality of life. So I've said, well, the transport affects London's sustainability and or people's quality of life in this way. Air pollution from car exhaust affects people's health and can cause asthma. Cars contribute to climate change, releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. People also can be impacted from long journeys caused by lots of traffic. And then try and give an example of a strategy or solution for this issue in London if you can. So London obviously has introduced the congestion charge in 2003, charging car drivers to enter central London. They've also now got the ULEZ charge, which is for lower emissions. So that is something that has come in since your textbook was produced, but the ULEZ will allow electric cars or cars that do not produce as many emissions to come into central London, and therefore those that are more polluting have to pay more in order to access the centre of London and the inner city. So that's another strategy. So you might be able to kind of research this yourself as well. Don't just rely on the textbook. If you don't want to, you can have a look at other sources too. Additionally, there are now 4,500 electric car charging points all around London. So if you do own an electric car, you can charge it up for free if you plug in, into one of those points. So that's really positive, and that will encourage people to be more sustainable, and it will also reduce the pollution within our local areas. So that's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to go through all of the information, complete this table, and then submit it to your teacher, please. The final task really is just this plenary. I would like you to think about your own experience of London. How sustainable is your London? I'd like you to write a list of all the ways in which your life in London is sustainable. You can think about the categories discussed today. So things like transport, how do you get around London? Do you cycle? Do you get public transport? Do you recycle your waste at home? Do you have enough green space? Does that improve your quality of life? And energy efficiency, is there anything that you do maybe in the home or at school? Is there anything that we do at school in order to try and be more energy efficient? So I hope that's all made sense. Obviously, you've got your drop-in sessions weekly, so we can discuss anything that you didn't understand from today's lesson. There is no practice exam question today, so all you need to do is task 1, task 2, which is the table, and the plenary, and submit that to your teacher. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I will speak to you again next week.